actually is 48 hours in the late spring of 1963, June 10th and June the 11th, in which he will go on what I call his lyrical journey to peace and freedom. Freedom is what I'll really talk about tonight, but peace is part of this too. And he does it in two seminal speeches he will give on these 2 days. One at American University in Washington, where he'll make an appeal to the Russians, but more than that, he'll make an appeal to the conscience of Americans. And he'll talk about seeing the Russians, the Cold War, and peace differently. And he'll make an appeal not so much to win the Cold War, but to end it. Next day, in another speech, he'll make what will be called, that speech will be called his peace speech. Next day, he'll give a speech which will be about civil rights. It's that I'd really like to talk to you about. Because that spring, Kennedy is facing in America an upheaval, and he's not so sure how to handle it. He knows that to be the great president he would like to be, because he was a student of history, that he can't simply ride the trends in America. He has to master them. He has to no longer be a servant of events. He can't simply respond to events. His administration has been called a laggard on civil rights. He's been said he hasn't done enough, that he's a bystander. And so when he's flying back to Washington overnight from Hawaii, where he's given an interesting speech at the end of 5 days of touring military bases. Last speech is in Hawaii, which is about civil rights. Had he opened, he's flying overnight, and he'll arrive on Air Force One in Washington, and he'll race up to the campus of American University, and he'll give that speech I just talked about, which will, as I say, ask Americans to look differently and ask different questions about the Russians. But on that very day, he's facing a crisis in Alabama. And had he opened his newspaper on that flight back, because he consumed newspapers, he was a speed reader and read 8 newspapers a morning. Someone said he drank printer's ink for breakfast, and he was very much a student of newspapers. Had he read the New York Times that morning, he would have seen just a bit about what 2 communities were thinking about what he was doing on civil rights. One was the American Jewish Congress, which I thought was still in existence, but Rabbi Goldenberg says it is not anymore. But the American Jewish Congress took a full page out of the newspaper on Monday, June the 10th, to tell the President of the United States, your civil rights approach is a folly and a failure. At the same time, Reverend King, Dr. King, had given an interview, it was on page 1 of the New York Times, in which he excoriated the Kennedy administration. He said that you've merely, looking at the Eisenhower administration, he said, you've merely replaced a miserable policy with an inadequate one. He did not know what was going on in the White House that day. He did not know what would happen the next evening. Because on that day, the president, after he's rushed back from American University, he's dealing with nuclear summitry in America, which is entirely different than it is today. He's thinking about civil rights because in Alabama, the pugnacious governor of Alabama, George C. Wallace, who had only been inaugurated 4 months earlier on a platform in which he said, and which he promised in his inaugural address, segregation yesterday, segregation today, segregation tomorrow. The Kennedys don't think much, and they are in the South called the Kennedys. John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy. They are called the Kennedys in the South. It doesn't matter what one of them does, they are seen together. And to this day, to show you the reverence that the Kennedys are held in black homes in the South, there will be 3 photographs on the wall in a black home. I've been in many of them. One's Jesus Christ, the other is Dr. King, and the third is Jack Kennedy. Or in some homes there are 4. There's Bobby Kennedy too. Well, the Kennedys are dealing with Wallace, who is refusing to integrate the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. It is the last of the big state institutions which is all white. This is an all-white apartheid America. People of a certain age will know that America that I only have a faint memory of, but it was an America in which blacks could not vote or hold office or serve on juries. Despite Brown versus Board of Education in 1953 or 4, most schools remained segregated. In most cities, blacks still moved to the back of the bus. They drank from separate water taps and sat at separate lunch counters, and that is if they sat at all. In the South, interracial marriage was a crime. In the North, where segregation endured, it was less egregious. Social clubs refused to admit blacks, as in many cases they refused to admit Jews. There were no black senators, there were no black cabinet secretaries, there were no black Supreme Court justices, and only 4 black congressmen of the 435 members of the House of Representatives. And that was the reason, in a sense, that America was in rebellion that spring, as it had been, in a sense, earlier. The Kennedys well remembered in September 1962, James Meredith had tried to integrate the University of Mississippi. It did not go well for James Meredith. There was a riot, the Klan gathered in Oxford, Mississippi, where the University of Mississippi is. The governor refused to admit James Meredith. The Kennedys had to call in the National Guard. It was slow and messy. There was a 15-hour riot in which 3 people were killed. Hundreds of people were injured, and Time magazine called it the greatest insurrection in the South since the Civil War. And that was the America in which the Kennedys had to operate. And they remembered that, and so when they were handling George Wallace on June the 10th and June the 11th, 1963, when George Wallace says, "I will stand in the door of the University of Alabama. I will not allow 2 black students, one named James Hood, the other Vivian Malone, both 20 years old, Alabamans who wanted an education." The Kennedys had to say, what will we do? The court had ordered the integration of that university. What will we do? How will it happen? He is going to stand in the door. Will we walk up to the door with these 2 students and they'll be turned away? And if they're turned away, will we have to arrest them? And if we arrest them, will we have to charge them with contempt of court? If we charge them with contempt of court, will we throw them in jail? If we throw them in jail, will there be another riot like there was at the University of Mississippi at Oxford 8 months earlier? And more than that, what's going to happen to the Democratic Party of the South? And I'd like to get reelected because I'm up for reelection in 18 months, and I didn't win by very much in 1960. More than that, what will Congress do in a circumstance like this? A Congress which is controlled by white, old Southerners who are threatening to take down my legislative program. So moving on civil rights is not easy for JFK and Bobby Kennedy in 1963. There are great, great dangers for them. But they know they will have to bring the power of the federal government down upon the state of Alabama if the presidency is going to have any sense of morality at all. And morality is a word that recurs in these 48 hours. Kennedy mentions it 3 times in his civil rights speech, and he mentions it in his speech on the Soviet Union because there is a connection between the 2. He says, peace and freedom walk together. And if the Russians are about peace, the University of Alabama, George Wallace, and the admission of those 2 black students, Negroes as they're called then, is about freedom. So all that afternoon and all that evening and the next day, the Kennedys are strategizing. And they're wondering how they'll handle Wallace and what he'll do. Wallace isn't returning their calls, so they don't know. He's as indifferent to their charm as he is indifferent to their scorn. He simply won't listen to them. Bobby Kennedy had been down to Alabama to see him, and when Bobby Kennedy drove in from the airport, he was so unwelcome in Alabama. There were signs, the KKK, Castro with a K, Cuba with a K, and Kite with a K. And Kennedy said, I thought my life, Bobby Kennedy, who would be killed almost exactly 5 years later, Bobby Kennedy said, my life was in danger going down there. That's how reprehensible they thought the government of the United States was in Alabama. So on that day, those 2 students will be accompanied by federal marshals to the University of Alabama. The story is caught brilliantly in a documentary film by Robert Drew, an early cinema verite filmmaker. Robert Drew is filming in the White House on these 2 days, and the documentary, which will be called Crisis Behind the Presidential Commitment, will describe what goes on. It's 52 minutes, and it aired on ABC in late October, about a month before President Kennedy was killed. What I learned were there were scores of hours of raw footage that is in Hollywood, and I'm believed to be the first to see it, which is filmed in the White House, and with the 2 black students as they're preparing to leave Birmingham, having gone up to New York and been tutored by the NAACP on how they ought to dress and what they ought to say as they will represent the government of the United States trying to integrate this all-white institution in Alabama. So at 11 o'clock on June the 11th, The two students will drive onto the campus of the University of Alabama, and there will be George Wallace at the door, a little man with a big complaint. And the Kennedys are very, very concerned about the dignity of these two black students. They're 20 years old. They have been in all black colleges in Alabama. They're not the face of protest as you might think in the 60s. They dress as if they're going to church. She wearing a string of pearls, he wearing a suit that could have been cut from Madison Avenue. They are told what to say, how to dress. They don't want to overthrow the system, they simply want to join it. And so they don't go to the door because the Kennedys say, we will not see them humiliated today. We will send marshals to the door. We'll send Nick Katzenbach, who will become Attorney General of the United States next year. One of the heroes, one of the paladins of the civil rights movement. You see a lot of them on these 2 days. Another is John Doerr, who just died about 6 weeks ago. John Doerr, you may remember him from Watergate, but long before that, John Doerr was the front man in the civil rights movement in Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department, which is full of these heroes. He would later, 2 years ago, get the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama. But on that day, John Doerr and Nick Katzenbach will go to the door. They will leave the two black students in the car. They will go to the door and say, Governor, we want to integrate this university. And the governor will say, we're not. They will withdraw. There's a standoff. The Kennedys will do what they know they have to do, which is to call the National Guard. And if they have to, they will carry the governor of Alabama away. But they're going to integrate this university. And that does happen later on. What's Kennedy going to do having integrated the university? He was never one to waste a crisis. And against the advice of everybody in his circle, except his brother, he says, now is the time to go on television, to make that speech on civil rights, and to introduce our intention to send to Congress the most sweeping civil rights bill in American history, what they have been working on for quite some time. This is not spontaneous, but the speech is. And that afternoon, late that afternoon, long after, just after the governor of Alabama has stepped away, which is 2 hours behind Washington, the president will turn to his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, and say, it's time to make that speech on civil rights. And I have booked the networks, 8 o'clock tonight, 15 minutes of time, and his speechwriter says, what speech? There is no speech. The speechwriter has 2 hours and 10 minutes to write the speech. And Ted Sorensen, it was a job for Ted Sorensen. If anybody could do this, it was the president's mellifluous wordsmith, Ted Sorensen. They'd been together 11 years. There was no combination like them in the history of the modern presidency. They knew what each other were thinking all the time. But Ted Sorensen had no file to go from. There weren't a lot of civil rights speeches the president had been giving. So he reaches back to the valedictory address he gave in Nebraska in high school, in which then, as a young progressive in Omaha, he talked about what was then called the plighted American Negro. And as it was not good in 1949, it was not good in 1963. And this will become the basis of the president's address. He will ask Americans to consider what it is like to be black in America in 1963. And so at 7 o'clock, there is still no speech. The president does something he's never done, Sorensen says. Sorensen himself died about 4 years ago. He leaves the Oval Office and he goes down to Sorensen's office. He said, Ted, you have the speech? Just coming out of the typewriter right now, Mr. President. Well, Kennedy said, well, gee, that's good because I thought I'd have to go on the air and wing it. Well, 45 minutes later, Kennedy having gone to the White House pool for a swim, because that's what he did in the crisis, he went swimming. Comes back, there's still no speech. He enters the Oval Office at 3 minutes to 8. He's handed something like a speech that Bobby has been putting together. And Burke Marshall, another one of the heroes of the civil rights movement. Meanwhile, Ted is making his contribution. The president will go on the air at 8 o'clock. He's the captain of pool. If anyone can do it, he can, but he's nervous because this is an important speech. It will be, for my money, the speech that day and the day before on peace and freedom will be his two most important speeches. The president will go on the air. He won't have an unfinished text, but he will go on the air and he'll talk in a way that this aloof, detached patrician from Boston, who never knew a black person in his life until he met his valet, who never spoke the language of the slave states as Lyndon Johnson did, and Eisenhower did, and Truman did. He never used the word nigger. He knew discrimination. He had been seared by the campaign in 1960 when he, a Catholic, had been the object or subject of religious freedom. He didn't know the black experience, but he'd come to learn it, and Dr. King and others were pushing him that day. And Ted Sorensen was pushing him that day. And it is about his education in this crowded hour. As he'll go on the air that night, I urge you to read the speech. It goes for about 14 minutes. At the 12-minute mark, it breaks because he runs out of text. You don't see it. There allegedly are pages being handled to him when it's on the air. What's important about that speech today, which Dr. King is watching? Kennedy is saying civil rights is no longer a legal question. It is a moral question. He's asking Americans the same thing he asked the day before. As I asked you yesterday to see the Russians differently, I'm asking you to see black Americans differently. The word, by the way, was Negroes. Hardly anyone used the word black Americans, Negroes differently. And so, let me just read you a bit. We're confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are going to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we're going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? It was Martin Luther King's sense that he was no longer going to be persuaded by the counsels of delay. He always said, it is time for the incrementalism to stop. It is time to move now. Kennedy gives this speech. It is a head-spinning performance, which, as I say, he will wing for the last 2.5 minutes. He will extemporize. Dr. King is watching the speech. Dr. King can't believe what he's hearing. And he jumps up out of his chair. He's with a colleague named Walter. And he said, Walter, can you believe that black man just stepped up? White man, I'm sorry. That white man had stepped up to the plate and hit it out of the park. He sends a telegram to the president saying, never did I expect the president of the United States to speak that way. President Kennedy invites Martin Luther King to the White House. Shortly after that, they are now allies. The NAACP and the black leadership had planned a march on Washington, at which Dr. King will give his I Have a Dream speech. It's already in the planning, and that march was to be against the administration. It's now no longer against the administration. The administration is now part of the planning of that march. It's about Congress and about raising awareness of civil rights. And so there's now a new coalition between President Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King, we'll see, I don't say they become friends, but in the last 5.5 months of his life, and it will end in Dallas, and it may be that the events in Dallas are in some way associated with the events of these 2 days. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But there is a climate of hate building in the United States. Kennedy's popularity will fall sharply in the South. It will fall almost everywhere. He's worried about his reelection, but he feels this is the thing he has to do. And so on that day, he'll go to sleep that night, but there's a coda, there's a terrible denouement to this hour and this day, in which a number of things happen. And I won't allude to them all except this. Down in Jackson, Mississippi, in a segregated subdivision, Medgar Evers, one of the other heroes of the civil rights movement, whom I felt I got to know in a sense, the unsung hero who put himself in danger at every turn. The NAACP virtually abandoned him when he asked for protection. He routinely was receiving threats at home. The day on June the 11th, when he gets up and leaves the home, his wife, Marilyn Evers, said he knew he was going to die that day. He twice came back to the house. He called her 3 times. He watched President Kennedy's speech. We don't know what he said. She waited up for him. She, having watched President Kennedy's speech down in Mississippi with her 3 children. And at 12:20, as he's coming in, to no doubt share with his family his thoughts on what had happened that evening. He's shot in his driveway and killed, and the president is awakened the next morning. They were going to awaken at 3 a.m., but they decide not to, and he's staggered by what he hears. So when I think of Martin Luther King, when I think of that hour, I think of what could have been, I think back to those several events in Kennedy's crowded hour, and think that might have been, or was, not might have been, it was the beginning. I think of course, different things happen at different times, but it was the beginning of a push which would, Lyndon Johnson would, and a bill and an idea that Lyndon Johnson would pick up, and that civil rights bill would be passed. It is, to me, the Kennedy-Johnson civil rights bill, because it was Jack Kennedy who proposed it and carried through Congress until the day he was shot. It was reported out of committee that day and was moving to the floor. Whether it would have got through is an open question. Johnson certainly had an ability to persuade that perhaps Kennedy didn't have, but that's open to question. But in any event, it passed. The Civil Rights Bill, which we marked everywhere, because this is not just an American story, it's a universal story. That was marked, of course, last June, and we will mark, I guess, later this year, the Voting Rights Act. So it began then, and it was an extraordinary collaboration and an awakening, and who knows where it might have led if the events, if things had not turned out the way they did. Thank you.
I hope that you'll make yourself available over coffee and cake later for questions, because I don't think we have time right now. But thank you so much for the story. Wow. So we will take in the words and we'll take in the story as we sing about you. We rise for Aleinu, page 586. Traditionally, at this time in our liturgy, we sing the words of the prophet, Ne'emar, V'haya Adonai l'melech al kol ha'aretz, v'yom ha'hu yihiyeh Adonai echad v'shelo echad. Thus it has been said, Adonai will be sovereign over all the earth. On that day, Adonai will be one, and God's name will be one. On that day, it's a prayer that looks forward to a day when the world will be one, when all people will be one, when there will be peace and equality and justice, when the world will be healed, perfect. So tonight we'll sing a modern version of Vayom Ha'hu, one day. I'm sorry we don't have the words, but we get to listen. Tonight, as we turn to Kaddish, we draw into our hearts all those who gave their lives in the struggle for civil rights. We also remember especially those victims of the recent terror attacks in Paris, journalists, cartoonists, Jews just going to buy a challah for Shabbos. And we also recall those whose yard sites fall this week. Our community remembers Norman Bass, Sarah Baum, Benjamin Beiser, Martha Bernstein, Harry Brightman, David Sorolnik, Gertrude Coville, Davida Schatz-Edelson, Eva Fisher, Irving Frum, Alana Hitchman, Irving Isaacson, Herbert Kabatsnik, Anna Kandel, Edna Kleiman, Dolores Malakoff, Yetta Michael, Abraham Pekaroff, Jacob Rabinowitz, Judith Shapiro, Cynthia Schiffman, Max Simon, Fanny Sober, Samuel Sondak, Rose Stolowey, Pearl Weiner, and Gilbert Ziff. And we remember those laid to rest during this past month. We remember Kim Turner, mother of Trina Schilling, and Stella DiNicola, mother of John DiNicola. If there are other names of folks you're remembering for Kaddish, you can say their names at this time.
Eleanor Adler. Eleanor.
Mourners and those who wish to join them, please rise. Kaddish is on page 598. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shnei rabba, v'alma tivrach v'tei yamliv malchutei, v'chayecho v'yomecho v'chayeh v'chol Beit Yisrael.